Up next, we hear the music of David Krakauer, a world-class clarinetist known for the intensity with which he interprets a wide range of musical genres. Here's a look at how he merges traditional and avant-garde sounds in his music.
If I look back and think about the things that I've been most proud of and most excited about, I have to say that's finding my individual voice on the clarinet, where you can drop the needle, so to speak, and you can say, oh, that's David Krakauer. I recognize that sound. I played the piano when I was 5, but it didn't catch. So when I was 10 years old, I had a chance to study an instrument, and my mother, being a violinist who had started at age 3, she said, well, you're 10 years old, and you're way too old to play the violin. And so she said, well, how about the clarinet or the flute? And she said it in that order. So I chose the clarinet. When I was about 11 years old, I received a present from my parents, a record of Sidney Bechet, of the great New Orleans jazz clarinetist and soprano saxophonist. And, while I had heard music growing up, I took it for granted a little bit. But when I heard Sidney Bechet, I kind of sort of connected the dots. I was able to say, oh, this is what music can do. Music can communicate on this level. So he kind of became my teacher who I had never met. Through high school, I was playing jazz and classical at the same time. And then musicians who knew me were saying, you should focus on classical because you're like all over the place. And I was also feeling like, playing jazz is a whole thing about originality, and it's about finding your own voice. So I started getting these big doubts when I was in my early 20s. So basically, I stopped playing jazz, and I said, okay, I'm gonna focus on classical music. But sort of secretly, I was experimenting with weird sounds on the clarinet and sort of weird kind of avant-garde improvising. And then when I was in my early 30s, I began to feel like that somehow I had thrown the baby out with the bathwater by abandoning jazz. I started checking out different kinds of music. But it really wasn't until about 1987 that I actually got into klezmer. And how it happened was I used to live on 80th Street and Broadway, right across from Zabar's. And in front of Zabar's, there was a small klezmer band. And several months later, I was on the 104 bus in New York City, and this woman walks in the door, and I said, oh, wow, you're the accordion player in that klezmer band in front of Zabar's. And she said, our clarinetist is leaving, and we're looking for a clarinet player. And the words just came out of my mouth like, I'd like to try. It was a real defining moment for me, because suddenly it became clear to me that this is my past, this is my parents, this is my grandparents, this is my great-grandparents, my great-great-grandparents. It's deep, deep, deep roots. And then suddenly, a band called the Klezmatics heard about me, and they invited me to come and play with them in Europe. I was very drawn to them because the Klezmatics took a very anti-nostalgia kind of attitude. And so it was like, we're making new music. We're relating more to pop and somewhat to jazz and to rock and to funk. And suddenly, all these little experiments that I was doing quietly started seeping into klezmer music. So this whole search that I had had my whole life, and then maybe 10 years of frustration, finally in the late 80s, I was starting to, find a musical home. Another important collaboration is with a young Canadian beat architect and producer, and his nom de plume is SoCal. And SoCal and I met at a klezmer festival called Klez Canada up near Montreal. And SoCal brought me this CD that he had basically made in his home studio, and it was called the Hip Hop Seder. And it was absolutely brilliant. He found this beautiful mix of samples of old Yiddish theater and klezmer and Hasidic nigunim, and so I asked him to be a featured artist with my band Klezmer Madness. And then SoCal said, what about Fred Wesley? Fred Wesley was James Brown's trombonist and arranger from the late 60s, early 70s, doing the horn arrangements with Parliament Funkadelic. One could argue that he almost created funk. And so we contacted Fred, and then so we were in a room together. SoCal hit one of his beats for this tune called Balabusta. And Fred started improvising, I started improvising with him, and we knew suddenly we had chemistry. We formed a real band, which we call Abraham Incorporated, because obviously Abraham is a kind of a great figure for Jews, for Christians, for Muslims, is sort of a great unifying father figure. Basically, my life is traveling internationally, touring, playing lots of concerts, and then coming back and just teaching wall to wall. So it's quite intense, but I just love it.
David Krakauer tours the world with this ensemble, Klezmer Madness and Abraham Inc. Krakauer has also shared the stage with some distinguished ensembles, including the Kronos Quartet, the Emerson String Quartet, and the Aspen Wind Quartet. You can also learn more at davidkrakauer.com.